This is Jim Cason with Riverbend Baptist Church in Riverbend, North Carolina, with the online Bible study for 24th of May 2020. The series is Biblical Significant Battles, and this particular message is the second portion of the life of the judge named Samson. This part really is probably one of the best known stories in the entire Bible by people who may not otherwise know very much about the Bible. But we're in Judges chapter 15 and looking for lessons from the life of this man Samson, of great physical strength and not always great spiritual strength. Last week we looked at the early part of his life, his first marriage, which things didn't go too well in. Now we're going to look at the next part. Starting with verse 14. When he, speaking of Samson, came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him, and then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of the donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. Well, back years ago when I was in television, we broadcast wrestling, and they did have some strange occurrences in that show, but I don't think any of them ever approached this idea of killing 1,000 men in a battle of 1 to 1,000. But the key to that battle is that the one with all the strength was not Samson. The one with all the strength was the Lord our God. Continuing on with verse 17. So it was, when he finished speaking, that he threw the jawbone from his hand and caused that place Ramoth Lehi. Then he became very thirsty. So he cried out to the Lord and said, You've given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? Just a little comment here. Right after a great spiritual victory seems to be the time that we are most inclined to doubt God. Even for people like Elijah. Remember, he single-handedly killed 400 prophets of Baal. Then he ran for his life against one woman. Now, she admittedly was a lot more vindictive than the prophets of Baal. But he goes out and he says, oh Lord, I might as well just die. That's not so. We have to believe all the way. Verse 19, so God split the hollow place that's in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank, and his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore he called its name On-Hakor, which is in Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Now remember in the book of Judges that the period of the Judges was a time when at the first of it, it says every man did that which was right in his own eyes, and that does not necessarily mean they did right, because the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked. And God, in this particular period of time, instead of sending prophets, sent people that he raised up to become judges. They normally would win some physical battle with God's help, and then they would be put in a place of judgment where they would judge the people and make decisions as to what was right and what wasn't. So Samson was one of the judges. Now going on to chapter 16 of Judges, starting with verse 4. Afterward it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, Entice him and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. There were 5 lords of the Philistines. 1,100 pieces each, 5,500 pieces of silver. Sounds like Judas kind of sold out for cheap at just 30. Anyhow, this was kind of tempting to Delilah, and the part they don't yet mention on this was there was also an inherent threat that if you don't do this, there's going to be bad things come to you. Verse 6, Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you." And Samson said to her, "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." This wasn't the truth. Kind of sounds like after that first marriage episode that Samson might have been just a little suspicious. Verse 8, the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, and she bound them with him. Now men were lying in wait, staying with her in the room, out of sight. And she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he broke the bowstrings, as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Verse 10. Now women can be persistent. Delilah then said to Samson, "Look, you mocked me and told me lies. Now please tell me what you may be bound with." So he said to her, "If they bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." Again, not the truth. Therefore Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them, and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And men were lying in wait, staying in the room. But he broke them off his arms like a thread. Verse 13. Delilah said to Samson, "Until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me what you may be bound with." And he said to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of the loom." So she wove it tightly with the batten of the loom, and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he awoke from his sleep, and he pulled out the batten and the web from the loom. Now each time when she was doing this, it mentions the sleep this time, but each time, in order for her to get by with doing that and for them to sneak into the room, he had to be asleep. So she got him sleepy. Then she would do whatever he had told her, and then she would holler around and warn him, and each time, same thing happened again. So she took this again. Verse 15. And then she pulled the love card in the modern vernacular. You know, you've heard of people pulling different kinds of cards. She said to him, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength lies." And it came to pass, when she pestered him daily with her words, and pressed him so that his soul was vexed to death. That's an interesting phrase. Pestered him daily with her words. Verse 17. That he told her all his heart, and said to her, "No razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." She wore him down. That's another great spiritual lesson. A lot of times we find it easy to resist something the first time, but it keeps gnawing away at us, keeps enticing us a little bit more. And what in February we would think, "Oh my God, I'm never going to do that." In March we begin to think, that does sound like it might be fun. In April we begin to think a little bit more about it. Next thing you know, we're doing it. keep that in mind when you get tempted a little bit. There's a few things in all the Bible it says flee from, run hard as you can, like as if you were out in the woods with no arms at all and a bear was chasing you. Run. And one of them is temptation, because it says he will make a way to escape. He doesn't say he's going to make a turnpike or an interstate highway to escape. He says he will make a way. But if you don't take that way, he may not make a way the next time. Verse 18, when Delilah saw that he had told him all his heart, she sent and she called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, Come up once more, for he has told me all of his heart. So the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hand. Then she lulled him to sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. And then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, The Philistines are upon you, Samson. So he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as before, as other times, and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. That's a very sad phrase. When we go out, now this doesn't mean losing your salvation if you're saved, but when we go out and we succumb to that temptation that's been over and over and over, we're going to have the consequences. The consequences won't be eternal death, but the consequences can be severe. Verse 21, the Philistines took him. They put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza. Gaza's got a long history of being a bad place. They bound him with bronze feathers, and he became a grinder in the prison. Now, what happened here? They put out his eyes because they were thinking if his strength ever does come back, we don't want him to be able to see, to be able to attack us. Then they bound him to make sure that he wouldn't be able to attack the guards, and he became a grinder in the prison. Now, the prisons tried to find some way, this has been for a long, long time, that the prisoners could work, as you might say, to earn their keep. And in this case, you were put in the place of an ox to grind meal or run an olive press or something like that. Verse 22, however, the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaven. Yeah, it will do that, at least until you get be bald. Okay, so Samson lived for a good little while there in prison, being tormented, having to work for nothing, not able to see. We move on down to Judges chapter 16, starting with verse 25. Now, this is after the Philistines have held a great big feast to their gods. And they've done this all up big, and they've got all the people out there, and all the leaders of the people and the lords and the kings are in this place just eating and drinking and making merry and doing all sorts of sinful things. When their hearts were merry, they said, Call for Samson that he may perform for us. Okay, so we're going to mock him and hurt him some more. So they called for Samson from the prison, and he performed for them. And they stationed him between the pillars that were holding up the building. Then Samson said to the lad who held him by the hand, Let me feel the pillars which support the temple, so I can lean on them. Now the temple was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there. A total of about 3,000 men and women on the roof watching while Samson performed. And then Samson called to the Lord, saying, O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars which supported the temple. He braced himself against them, one on his right, the other on his left. And then Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. And he pushed with all his might, and the temple fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life. The Lord is the one that owns revenge, but it kind of looks like he gave Samson the blessing of doing it. And another particular thing about that, Samson was quite willing to die in order to do this. He knew he was going to be with God. Verse 31, his brothers, all his father's household came down, and they took him, and they brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. He had judged Israel for 20 years. So that's the life of Samson, the judge, and the lessons that we can learn just from that. Prayer needs this week. Lewis Eames, he's been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. He's in the hospital in the western part of the state. His wife Frances is there. I'm not sure if Rusty, his son's there or here, but Frances is not being allowed to see him because of the present lockdowns. And the family needs prayer. Vicky Hardy with cancer. Linda Thomas, same. Ray and Christy and Matthew. The family I mentioned in Connecticut the past several weeks. This woman left as a young widow with 2 young children, Katie, Braden, and Penelope. Doug and Rosalind. Bob and Janet. Wisdom for our local churches as we begin some in-building worship with precautions. It was announced by North Carolina's governor that we would be moving to phase 2, where more things would be opened up, and the governor apparently listened to the United States Attorney General saying, you can't really do that on account of the Constitution. So in this particular order, all of the restrictions, legal restrictions by him, were removed from churches and other religious institutions. They're still suggestions, but they no longer have any force behind them. Pray for local businesses that are still hurting, especially those that are not yet permitted to reopen. I've got some friends in various ones of these, and I really look at some of this stuff, and a lot of it really looks arbitrary, but to me, I know God has his purpose, and I just ask God right now, sustain these people that are not yet permitted to reopen. Help them to not lose the businesses that they've worked, some of them for decades, to build. For the pastors, the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, and teachers, in addition to the other works and ministries, for effectiveness in increasing those that are within the kingdom of God. Now, next week, we have a special event in both the Jewish world and the Christian world. Started out in the Jewish world. Next Thursday, the 28th of May, through Saturday, the 30th of May, starting the evening of the 28th through the evening of Saturday, is Shauvot, the Feast of Weeks. Now, the special thing about the Feast of Weeks is that it was tied on the Hebrew lunar calendar. It was tied to the Passover. It was 7 weeks plus 1 day after the Passover. 50 days after Passover. Now, this means based on our calendar, it does change exactly which days it is, because that's the Jewish thing. But the Christians celebrate on that Sunday, the first day of the week, which would have been the 50th day, a holiday named Pentecost. And if you remember from the book of Acts, Pentecost was a very great time for the church. The very early church, over 3,000 were added to the church on that day. So, God willing, that's what we're going to be looking at next week. I'll be covering this with the historical significance, the biblical significance, the significance in the Jewish faith, and the spiritual significance of this in our worship and celebrations today. Have a blessed day. May the Lord be with you.